This is the story of a man who for a long time was one of the most wanted criminals in the United States. For 18 long years, police all over the country tried to find him while he lived life to the fullest and drove the FBI astray. Therefore, what did he do that was so terrible, and how did he manage to hide for so long? The List family lived in a large 3-story house in Westfield, New Jersey. The head of the family, Johnlist, worked in an executive position at a local bank, a good salary that allowed him to have a large home and provide well for his family. He was married to a woman named Helen. They were married for more than 20 years and during that time had 3 children together. The first child was born in 1955. It was a girl named Patricia. Within the next 3 years, John and Helen had 2 more boys, John and Frederick. John Sr.'s mother, 84-year-old Alma, also lived with the family in their large home. In November 1971, neighbors of the List family sounded the alarm. Because no one had seen the residents of the house for almost a month, the children were not going to school, and the family had stopped attending the local church, which was uncharacteristic of them. Some thought they had gone on vacation, but it was disconcerting that the house lights were constantly on, so neighbors called the police to check if everything was okay at the List family home. The front door of the house was locked, but the police managed to get into the house through one unlocked window. The house looked completely empty. It was almost as cold as the street, but even though it looked like no one was home, for some reason there was very loud church music playing, which made the situation even stranger. There was also a very unpleasant smell in the house, similar to the smell of decaying flesh. The source of the smell was in the main living room of the house, where the police found 4 human bodies lying next to each other, each on a blanket. It was Helen List and her 3 children. All 4 victims were shot at close range. The death of the family's oldest son, 15-year-old John Jr., stood out in this horror, who, unlike the others, received not 1 but 10 bullet wounds. It looked very strange why the killer paid so much attention to the 15-year-old's John. Police noticed that blood trails led into the kitchen, indicating that the victims had been killed there, and then someone dragged their bodies into the living room. In the kitchen, they also found paper bags full of bloody towels, as well as a bloody mop with which the killer had tried to cover his tracks. Police continued their search of the house and found another gruesome scene on the 3rd floor, where they found a 5th body, that of 84-year-old Alma List, who had also been killed by a gunshot to the head. The police then searched the father's room, and in one of his drawers found 2 guns and a letter written by the killer, addressed to the pastor of the church the List family attended. The letter was written by John List. Ballistics tests confirmed that the List family had been killed with 2 guns found in their home. By the time police discovered the bodies of the murdered men, they had been dead for about a month. The face of the head of the family, John List, was also removed from all the family photographs in the house. 2 days after police found the bodies, John List's car was found. It was parked near Kennedy International Airport in New York, 70 kilometers from the List family home. The parking ticket was dated November 10th, but police had great doubts that List had flown somewhere from that airport after all. Only one fact was undisputed. Wherever John was now, he had a month's head start on the police. At that time, the crime shook the entire United States, and the search for John List became a priority for the authorities. In every police station in the country, John List's picture hung in the most prominent place. But as time went on, and despite this increased attention from the authorities, John still managed to remain undetected. It seemed absolutely impossible that none of the police around the country would meet him. Such skillful conspiracy making the police seriously think that Johnlist was no longer alive. The police were inclined to believe that after killing his family, John committed suicide in a place where his body was almost impossible to find. As a result, the Johnlist case continued to lie on the shelves of investigators. After 18 years of unsuccessful searches, the detectives had the idea to enlist the help of journalists. During those years, there was a very popular show on television in the United States called America's Most Wanted, and it occurred to the police to put Johnlist on the show, hoping that one of his current neighbors would recognize him and report it to the police. However, there was one problem. The picture the police had of Johnlist had been taken a year before his family was murdered, and to show it made absolutely no sense because the perpetrator looked very different now. Nowadays, with the help of computers, forensic specialists can generate in 10 minutes dozens of versions of how a person might look like 20 years later. But this was 1989, and then it was impossible. But the police still managed to find a way out of this situation. They turned for help to a sculptor named Frank Bender. He had helped the police before, usually by reconstructing the faces of people in cases where their found bodies had already been completely decomposed, and he only needed a skull to reconstruct the face of the deceased and thereby make it easier for the police to identify the person found. He was a master of his craft. For example, you can compare the face he reconstructed from only one skull of a girl and the real photograph. However, this time he had a different task: to model what this man would look like in 20 years. Frank approached his task very carefully. He said he needed to learn everything about Johnlist and literally become him himself. Therefore, a forensic psychologist came to his aid to draw a psychological portrait of the fugitive. Working together, they still managed to make a sculpture of the alleged appearance of Johnlist, who had aged 20 years. However, after the sculpture was finished, there was still one detail that had to be puzzled over: whether Johnlist started wearing contact lenses instead of glasses, and if not, what style of glasses he wears now. The psychologist suggested that List was not so watchful of his appearance that he replaced his glasses with contact lenses. He also believed that the glasses John wore now were different from those he had worn when he was 46. The psychologist believed that the fugitive had changed the style of the glasses frame. He thought that List wanted to look more important than he really was, and most likely, he now wore glasses with a thin, dark frame. Now the final bust of Johnlist has been completed and handed over to reporters. On May 21, 1989, an episode of the show about Johnlist appeared on the air. It seems incredible, but the sculpture was so accurate that one family in Denver, Colorado, immediately recognized the man shown as their former neighbor, Robert Clark. They immediately contacted the FBI and told them everything they knew about Clark, who had recently moved to Richmond, Virginia, and the FBI had no trouble locating him. When the agent came to see him at work, he asked, "Are you Robert Clark?" To which the man replied, "Yes." Then the agent asked, "Are you Johnlist?" The man replied, "No, I am Robert Clark," but the fingerprints left no doubt. Robert Clark was in fact Johnlist, and now, 18 years later, he was arrested for the murder of his entire family. The big surprise was the fact that Johnlist, when arrested, was wearing exactly the same glasses as the psychologist predicted. However, what is the backstory of this case? And what made Johnlist go out of his way to kill his entire family? 18 years ago, Johnlist was a very religious man, but his wife Helen proved to have absolutely no interest in religion. She began to skip church services, trying her best to avoid them. With the birth of her third child in 1958, Helen became addicted to drink, addicted to antidepressants, saw a psychiatrist instead of church, spent more money than her husband earned, and neglected her children so that John had to take care of them. John's career was also going downhill. The company where List worked merged with another, and he was fired and took a job at the Xerox branch in Rochester, New York. Despite the hardships, Helen did not think to change her lifestyle. She still did not know the measure of her spending. And what's more, List noticed that his wife began to pay attention to other men. In the end, the job at Xerox also had to leave, but John was lucky to get a good job. He was accepted as controller of the First National Bank in Jersey City, New Jersey, and the family moved to Westfield. In 1965, John asked his mother to loan him money for a down payment on the very house in which the murder was later committed. John's mother, Alma, willingly agreed, but on the condition that she live with them. About a year later, again came a black streak. New times demanded new skills that John did not possess. Family troubles prevented him from mastering them, and soon he was fired from the bank. And here he was faced with a lot of problems that he was not able to solve. He was unable to pay the house loan and huge utility bills, and the family expenses were only growing. Helen had no interest in his life. She only wanted to spend money. The children were becoming teenagers, and that meant only one thing: he needed more money. Johnlist could not find the strength to tell his family at home that he had been fired. After he was fired, he left home every morning and spent the day at the train station reading a newspaper or a book, thus creating the illusion for his family that he was at work. He did this for almost 6 months before he finally found a new job in New York. But it didn't do much to save the situation, since his family's expenses weren't covered by it. Helen continued to drink, and he tried to please her, managing to buy expensive things, counting on approval, which was not there. He began to sleep in another room to avoid her eyes and not to tolerate barbed remarks. List prayed even harder, trying to get answers on how to overcome the lingering crisis, but there was no end to the troubles. He was constantly anxious. He felt that his life was falling apart, and for him, it was a real disaster. List began to be stricter with the children, trying to make them obey his rules, but they began to rebel, especially Patricia. She was dressing provocatively, became independent, became interested in the theater and the occult. Her father suspected that she was taking drugs, and it did not fit in the framework of his church views. He could no longer cope with the problems that were weighing on his shoulders, and in 1971, Johnlist made a decision that he felt was the only right one for the situation. He believed that the devil was beginning to possess his family, and to prevent this from happening for good, he decided to cut off their lives while they were still pure and clean. By the morning of November 9, 1971, Johnlist already knew he was going to kill his family. He had made sure in advance that no mail or milk was brought into the house that day and the following days, and he called the school, warning the teachers that their family was going away for a while. John gave the first death sentence to his wife Helen. He found her in the kitchen sitting in front of the window. The sheet raised his 9mm pistol and fired a bullet into her head. The bullet went through the back of her head and shattered her jaw, and the woman fell to the floor dead. Johnlist then went up to the 3rd floor to his mother's room. She was also getting ready for breakfast and asked his son about the noise that came from below, and he responded by also firing a bullet into her head. He tried to move his mother's body to the first floor, but later abandoned the idea, as he was unable to do so. Then List went downstairs and grabbed Helen by the legs and dragged her body into the central hall, leaving a trail of blood behind him. He tried to wash the blood off, but gave up the idea when he noticed that he was covered in blood from head to toe. John made his way to the matrimonial bedroom and then the adjoining bathroom. There he vomited on the toilet seat, List leaving a bloody palm print, a distinct mark for future forensic examination. Having recovered, List got up for a shower. Then he changed into a fresh shirt and business suit. Now he had to wait. He went to the kitchen and cooked himself lunch. Suddenly the phone rang, startling him. It was his daughter Patricia. She said she wasn't feeling well and asked her father to pick her up from school, which was not part of his plan, but he had no choice. When he returned from school with his daughter, he promptly entered the house before his daughter and hid behind the door. As soon as she closed the front door behind her, he pointed the gun at her and fired a bullet into the back of her head. He had to make another trip to school. This time, it was to pick up his youngest son, Frederick. When they returned home, the boy had suffered the same fate as his sister, and now only the oldest son, 15-year-old John Jr., was left alive. List waited for him after soccer practice. He happened to glance out the window and see son walking down the path to the house. Either practice was canceled or John Jr. decided to skip it. It didn't matter. It was necessary to act. List didn't want his son to notice the corpses of his mother, sister, and brother. As soon as the boy closed the door, he immediately saw the gun pointed at him in his father's hand. The boy's composure and eagerness for life proved high, and resisting, he managed to grab his father's hand. So the first few bullets hit the walls of the house. Only on the fifth attempt did List Sr. manage to hit his son, hitting him in the neck. The boy fell to the floor, but he was still alive. The father stood beside him and fired all the remaining bullets from the magazine of the pistol into his son's body. When everyone was already dead, the father of the family knelt down in front of the bodies and recited a requiem prayer. He spent the night in the billiard room, not far from the bodies. In the morning, John set the thermostat to the lowest setting to be as cold as possible, lit the lights in every room, and turned the radio up to full volume. He put some clothes in his suitcase, and with $2,000 in his pocket, and he was ready to start a new life. He went to suburban Denver, Colorado, where he rented a small trailer in Denver. He changed his name to Robert Clark, using a fake social security card. He took a job as a cook at a local hotel, and then he became an assistant manager and accountant. By early 1975, he felt confident enough to return to the church. He joined the parish of St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Denver. The following year, he got a driver's license and bought a car. He used it to travel to the infirm members of the church, carrying food and other assistance. In time, Robert Clark, aka Johnlist, was elected to the financial board of the church. At this point, he realized that he would no longer be caught, and he was ready for a full new life. Later, he met a divorced woman named Dolores Miller. He began courting her. List seemed to Dolores a mild-mannered man who had personal drama in his life. He told the woman that his wife had died of cancer. He never showed her picture, nor did he show her anything else from his past life. In 1985, they married. But ironically, it was the meeting with Dolores that killed John List, because the woman who recognized him on TV was Dolores's best friend, and Dolores couldn't believe that her good-natured husband Robert Clark was a cold-blooded killer, John List. During the trial, List's lawyer felt that there was no point in denying the obvious. The defense only tried to minimize the imminent punishment, but the guilt was too great, and as a result, John List was found guilty on 5 counts and was sentenced to 5 life sentences in prison. He lived in prison for another long 18 years and did not die until 2008 at the age of 82.